Howdy! Welcome to Moonlight Less Than Moonlight. I'm Justin, and today we'll be talking about Irène Mathieu's self-portrait as a series of bent zoning laws. Before we begin though, as this is my first video, I want to mention two things. First, at the beginning of this year, Lee & Low Books released a survey that found that 76% of the overall publishing industry was white. This is an unacceptable lack of representation at every level, and the consequences of this lack of representation is palpable. For instance, the novel American Dirt, which was published last year, is the story of a Mexican mother and son fleeing from a Mexican drug cartel for America. But it was written by a woman who identified as white as recently as 2016 and only revealed a Puerto Rican grandmother just as the book launched, as reported by Vulture. Their article also quotes New York Times book critic Parul Segal's review, which said in part, "It is determinedly apolitical. The deep roots of these forced migrations are never interrogated. The American reader can read without fear of uncomfortable self-reproach. It asks only for us to accept that these people are people, while giving us the saintly to root for and the barbarous to deplore, and then congratulating us for caring." But, and to the second point, it is necessary that white cis-het people be uncomfortably self-critical and politically conscious. The consequences of neither actively working to diversify our publishing industry and reading habits, the consequences of not examining how our perspectives are colored by our society's biases, leads us to create works that reproduce the psychological and physical violence underrepresented people perpetually live with for merely existing in a society that deems them inherently less valuable. It is easy to say, these people are people, and far harder to not make choices that contradict this. In that vein, I want to make it clear that I am a white cis-ace man, and that this channel is dedicated exclusively to engaging underrepresented voices. Furthermore, this channel will be a space where I hope people can feel comfortable criticizing my ignorance and actively engaging each other in a raw and fruitful discussion. Because poetry, if it is anything, is the literary form where readers and writers most invest themselves. On that note, I am choosing not to read these poems aloud, but I will link the poems themselves in the description below, with a link to the author reading them where possible. With all that said, let's talk about Irène Mathieu's self-portrait as a series of bent zoning laws, published in issue 8.1 of Louisiana State University's New Delta Review. I'll wait for you here while you check it out. Quick editor's note, trigger warning for a mention of suicide. Okay, awesome. Good to see you again. Let's talk. To start from the top, I find the title interesting enough to pause over. It connects the speaker's identity, self-portrait, directly to not just a physical space, zoning, and a legal space, zoning laws, but also to a malicious political intent built into those spaces, bent zoning laws. It sets you up to think of this self-portrait less as a one-and-done selfie kind of thing, and more as something that's crafted by the actions of other people, and which persists way beyond those or any one group of people, a series. It's possible, from this title, that two people could have very similar self-portraits. And in the case of this poem, of course, these two people would be black, as may be obvious from the words colors lines framing the poem, which I found a striking touch. Obviously it mirrors the literal shape of a portrait frame, but it's also a clever way to make tangible the title's idea that historical political practices create the framework in which identity is formed. Practices like denying loans or insurance based on race, also known as redlining, over which both Wells Fargo and First Merchants Bank paid settlement fees last year, and zoning neighborhoods so that neither apartments nor Section 8 housing can be built, which disproportionately affects people of color. The colors lines include a lot more too, some of which you probably also saw in the poem. So for now, I've just left a link to a 2016 study by Professor Narinda Brown Hyatt called Section 8 is the New N-Word. It wasn't surprising to me that the poem began talking about property and ownership then, both regarding the speaker's grandfather's farm and the enslaved state of the speaker's great-to-the-fifth grandmother. The emphasis seems to be on the meaningful reversal from owned to owning that takes place wholly in its own brief stanza. But I think this first stanza also emphasizes how contemporary this experience is, despite the seeming distance, exemplified by the fact that the speaker's grandfather's great-grandmother is named, has the weight of presence that a name gives. And also, I think importantly, the space between grandmother and Addie visually echoes the idea of pseudo-distance the stanza attempts to point to. It may be a tab instead of a space, but it ain't that far still. Coming upon the scene of the speaker's father beggingly repeating, "I'm a doctor," to the police officer, it is worth noting the emphasis, the repetition, for one, and giving children the start of the next line to put weight on the father's pleading tone. My first thought was of Dr. Ocean Sweet, and if you'll permit me a second to give context. Dr. Sweet was a black physician who moved into a white neighborhood in Detroit with his family in the 1920s, which caused a white mob to threaten and eventually attempt to break into his house. One white man was killed, and another was wounded because Sweet and his family defended themselves. However, the cops, who had watched the entire scene unfold, arrested the Sweets. It's a fairly well-known story involving a young NAACP and old Clarence Darrow. After a mistrial and then eventually acquittal, Dr. Sweet would escape the penal system's hold, though not without cost. His wife would pass a fatal case of tuberculosis onto their child, which she caught while in jail, before succumbing to it herself, which would be followed a decade later by his younger brother. He would never return to their old house, and was in fact forced to sell it in the 1950s in order to pay off his debts. In 1960, Dr. Ocean Sweet committed suicide. The reason I thought of Sweet's tragic story is twofold. One, it contextualizes the kind of anxiety a black doctor might generally feel, trapped between a typically upper middle class occupation and an anti-black society that wants to suppress their upward mobility. Which is also what the speaker is thinking about, no doubt, when they say they're mad, but, quote, don't know if I should be, he is a black man, and he is alive, end quote. Of course, we can't forget the endless contemporary examples of white supremacy either. I also thought of it because it recontextualizes the speaker's neighborhood. When they mention all the instances of objects not being their artifacts of violence, with rope is just rope being probably the most chilling phrase in this entire poem for me, and especially with the mention of knowing good backyards, which invokes the generally white suburbs, the colors lines starts looking less like a designation for where the speaker is trapped within. That's to say, the neighborhood becomes a suburb and the colors lines are keeping people like the speaker out of it. It starts to look more like the shaping of what 20th century sociologist, historian, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness. The sensation, as Du Bois called it, that to be black is to be either American or black. That the history of black America is this history of, quote, two warring ideals, end quote. Which is with us in the poem from the first stanza, setting us up to read the poem as a reflection on the question of what is and isn't inherited. In a sense, then, you can read this doubledness into a lot of the poem itself. Growing up as learning to guard one's things has two valences from this angle. Either as the way in which redlining creates poverty, which leads to higher rates of theft that need to be guarded against, or as a consciousness of the fragility of black wealth and the fear of losing what little peace it affords. The fruit fly on the trash heaps of the following stanza can be read as either the buildup of trash because of lack of government services like garbage pickup, or as a grim depiction of the blatant overconsumption common to the suburbs. Parallel to these stanzas is probably my favorite part of the poem. I think it gives the poem a neighborhood feeling, as if the box closing the words in were a house with the street of circumstances passing it by and trash heaps of experiences on those streets. More than that, though, it acts as the only refuge within the poem from the poem itself. While colors lines run down the sides with mechanical cruelty and artifacts of violence swarm about in disrupted lineage, you have really humble shells, beads, quartz, pens, and, my favorite, particularly round acorns, which get to count as precious things. There's a thank God for the simple things vibe here, which mirrors a deep sense of relief they must provide to the speaker, but it also drives you towards the humanity amidst the violence and oppression. It represents to me the only moment of choice on the speaker's part within the poem. Here is this child picking particularly round acorns off their lawn and putting them in a box to look at later. Here is this innocent image belied by the collapsing of this historical struggle to escape into a single line, to have gotten, to have almost always been over. And I find the distinction between the parentheses for almost and the brackets for the following line interesting. Parentheses typically being an aside within the text, and brackets typically being an extra textual clarification, we get the sense, and I think with some irony, that a previously unseen speaker is forcing us to ask the vital questions of what is gotten over and who witnesses it. They read to me almost like understated questions, the kind of questions you send to a friend with only a period, because you share context for understanding the tone. I'd like to add, too, that this seems to me to extend the idea of doubledness even into the voice of the poem itself. The center-justified stanza seems to me to be the peak of the poem, hence the centering of it. The commonest pre-existing condition, congenitally, centrality of the self. While the medical jargon of pre-existing and congenitally reminds us of the speaker's father and thus the issue of well-being and its relationship to inheritance, it also pushes us towards reading the centrality of the self ironically, because there's very little self centered about things which predate you and you have no control over receiving. And paired with the visual irony that this is the only portion of the poem that's centered, suggesting that the very idea of centrality of the self is an idea that exists just to justify, pun intended, itself, it's an absolutely climactic moment. And so the poem slows down near the end with the image of the creeping kudzu of something like a cousin of guilt. Kudzu vines are invasive plants predominantly in the southern U.S. that thrive by climbing up other plants in order to reach light, which inevitably prevents the host plants from receiving light, killing them. This something familial to guilt, which the space at the beginning of the line leaves room to claim is the centrality of the self, hints at why the speaker is communicating in the poem. It can be read as a reflection on how the murderous light obsession of kudzu mirrors the way in which modern ideas of race and whiteness were developed in the 17th century as a way to justify the chattel slavery system that had grown massively as a response to labor demands. This confrontation with pre-existing conditions then leads to 3 questions. Who can be comfortable in a backyard like that, which is to say, good backyards that are heavy with not being artifacts of violence? Who can be safe, which is to say, where is safety in perpetual fiscal fragility and the risk of violence because of your blackness? If this stolen land isn't for everyone, then it's for... which needs a little unpacking because it's important that this is a question without a question mark, and an if without an if. Stolen land is a viciously multivalent phrase. It can refer to the fact that Europeans and Americans stole what is called America today from indigenous people, or it can refer to how it was built on the backs of black people via slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration, or it can refer to how it was actively and violently stolen from black people via white campaigns of violence, such as Tulsa's Black Wall Street in 1921 and Wilmington in 1898, which makes the empty brackets at the end clearer. They're asking a question in the same way the if is asking if. And to me, the trick of this bracket is the final brilliant trick in the physical shape of the poem. The only thing in the bracket is whiteness. It throws us back into the materiality of the poem, into how the poem and the self are shaped by their contexts. Most impressively, it turns the unspoken and intangible structures behind bent zoning laws into the most concrete and realized aspect of the experience of reading it. So that's Irène Mathieu's self-portrait as a series of bent zoning laws and some thoughts on it. I apologize to Irène Mathieu for probably butchering her name, but that aside, what were your thoughts? Do you agree, disagree, favorite line, any poems you like and want to see a breakdown of? Whatever you want to talk about, go ahead and leave a comment. Also, don't forget to check the description for links to some of the sources and to Irène Mathieu's site, where you can read even more of her work. Otherwise, thanks for sticking around, and until next time.